Commandment of God, or we'd find some way to get me to for me to stand up. It's not a commandment; it's a tradition. But it's a tradition that Yeshua and his Talmudim followed. And for those of you who don't know, that's Jesus and his disciples. They followed this. In fact, all Jews of the first century, all of the people in the New Testament that believed in God, they all did this. They all covered their head with a tallit when the scriptures were read. So we do it because it's a tradition that our Lord followed. It's that simple. Our verse today is from Tehillim, which is Psalm. If you don't know, that's the book of Psalm, 119, 165. So it's chapter 119, verse 165. And it says, Shalom Rav Le'ohave Torateha Ve'ein Lamo Michsho. All right, you may be seated. I bet you there was a couple of words in there you guys recognize, huh? Our first word was shalom. Shalom, y'all. All right, shalom is used, it's translated almost always as peace, but it's to be whole, entire. It's used of the body to be healthy. It's used of the mind to have a sound mind. It's used to be secure and tranquil, wholeness, safety, soundness, health. Right? It's used of all of those things. It's from the root shalom. Now, if you were to take that H out, what word would you have? Salem. Isn't that ironic? The Salem witch trials, the peace witch trials? It's the same. All right, so it's from the root shalom, which is where they get the word Salem, by the way. It's to be whole or sound or safe, to be completed, finished, to have peace, friendship with anyone. All right. We think of it, it's used for peace in English because you get that concept of, well, if there's no war, you're at peace. If you have a good friendship with your neighbors, then you're at peace with your neighbors. If you owed somebody some money and you paid that money off, then you're at peace with that person. That's something really more biblical than what we used it for. But that's the reason why they use the word peace, because there is a connection there with the English word peace. But you have to understand, these are Jews. All of the New Testament, every last word of it was written by Jews. Of course, so was the Old Testament, as it's called. All of that was written by Jews. Oh, wait a minute, Robert. Luke wasn't a Jew. He was a Greek. No, he wasn't. No, he wasn't. And here's how I know. One, I know that Luke is the Greek word that means light bearer. If you know any Hebrew at all, what name would come to mind if I said it means light bearer? Aharon, Aaron, that means light bearer. His name was Aharon, it was Aaron. Besides that, there's the whole no Jew in the first century, in that time period, would have listened to a Gentile about biblical things under any, there's no way under any circumstances that would have taken place. They did not have political correctness. They did not have higher thinking and enlightenment, if you will. They had none of those things. The Jews taught the Bible. Nobody else was allowed to. Nobody. And even among the Jews, only those who were trained by rabbis were allowed to teach. So if you gave an opinion and you were not on the Bible and you were not a trained rabbi, they would drag you into a synagogue, tie you up, and whip you because it was against the law. Not Bible law, but it was against the Jewish law. And they had the legal right. The Romans allowed them to snatch you up, take you into their synagogue, tie you to a post, and whip you. Yeah, they had the right to do that. If you gave so much as gave an opinion, because if you weren't a rabbi. So, what's the likelihood that somebody who wasn't a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi, was writing a letter to the synagogues? Oh, they were the churches. Let's not even get into that. There weren't any churches in that time. Paul did not go around starting churches. The word church wasn't used in the Bible until the King James Bible came out because he commanded that they use the word church instead of ecclesia. Well, church means ecclesia. No, it doesn't. It just does now because that's what we made it mean after King James stuck his nose in it where it didn't belong. No, in the first century, you had to be a Jewish rabbi or you weren't teaching. You sure weren't writing down the history of the Jews when you weren't a Jew. It just didn't happen. And then there's the other part. Um, only some of the things that he wrote about, only those who were Levites who actually worked in the temple would have known those details. And they're in that book. Hello. The man was a Jew. Every last word of it was written by a Jew. 2 Jewish synagogues concerning the Jewish uh, religion. And if you can't handle that, I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do about it. The truth is the truth. It is what it is. And I'm not apologizing for the truth. I'm apologizing for you. You can't handle it. You can't handle the truth. I'm just saying. Anyway, I've said all of that to say this. When they use the word shalom in this context, they're not talking about the lack of war. They're not talking about you being peaceful and tranquil in your life. They're talking about you being complete. And in their world, completion, he is faithful and just to finish, to complete what he began. That work that he began in you. What is the work? It's the Torah. He started you off on the Torah. Take my yoke, my Torah upon you, and learn of me. For my Torah, my yoke is easy, and my oath, my laws. Yeah, that's what they're talking about. They are talking about somebody who learned the Torah, learned the law, and applied it to their life. That person is called that person. That person doesn't get knocked down like one. Well, Rob. Okay, so the next word being Rob. Now, if I said Rob, you might catch it. I might have to actually say Rabbi. It's from the root Rob, Rabbi, Rabbi, my rabbi, Multius. It's whether one of continuous thing or of collectives which contain many parts, many individual things, numerous great parts. It goes off the mark. We're talking about all these things, like God somebody memorize the law, like somewhere between 12 and 12. They didn't have TV, they didn't have radio, they didn't have sports. They learned the Bible and they memorized it. This is your average Joe, everyday Jew walking the streets. That's how well they knew the Bible. And they didn't consider themselves knowledgeable enough about it to have an opinion. So you have to be trained by the rabbi and become a rabbi, and that being from the root Rav, because you had a great understanding. You've gone on to graduate school and postgraduate school, and you had great knowledge of the subject. Once you had that under your belt, then you could be called a more a teacher or a rabbi, a Rav, a rabbi. You could be called those things. You could actually even be called Lord. I don't would have been the word, but all of those things they called them because of their vast knowledge. Now they also called people Lord that had authority over them because they were above. He was called great for Rav because of the great amount of education, not because he was special. You need to keep that in mind when you think of that. Calling someone a rabbi, you're not calling him a great person, a greater than somebody else, or exalted above somebody else. You're just acknowledging that he has more education. That's all that's ever been about. When it becomes some personal comment, rabbi because I'm special, well, there's a problem. That's not what it's for. All right, so our next word is me'ohave. You hear a hav, you hear the sound, the love. That's how you actually say the word in its root. We say a hav so that people know what we're talking about. One or anything in doing something, right? And then it says Torateha. Do you hear Torah there? You should, because that's the word, Torah. And when they say Torateha, they're saying your instruction. Instruction. Because the word Torah does not mean law. It is not the Hebrew word for law. It should never have been translated law in English. That is so utterly wrong. Because mitzvot, mitzvah, those are the words for law. But when you're talking about, well, okay, so the law says don't kill. All right, now you're going to need instruction. Well, is it, well, it says don't murder, actually, it doesn't say don't kill. So now you need instruction. Well, what is murder? I mean, this guy broke into our house last week and just busted down the door and just started shooting. So I shot back and killed him. Is that murder? No. See, the instruction tells you that's self-defense. So you understand that there's a law, and then there's instruction on how you apply the law, how you understand the law. You have to have the instruction. So the Torah is not the list, so much the list of the laws, though it's there. It's the instruction on how you live out the law. That's why there's 613 instructions on how to live out 10 laws, if you will, because there's 10 categories. It doesn't say 10 commandments. It says 10 words. Devarim is the word in Hebrew, and that's word, davar. Devarim is davar in plural. That means the word, we would say words. And so what are they saying? Categories. There's 10 categories of law. They break them down into 613 individual instructions on those laws that fall under those 10 categories. All right. So it's instruction. They use it today of the first 5 books of the law, but of the Bible. But I don't know if you know this, but during the first century period, during the writing of the New Testament period, right, the time of Yeshua, or Jesus as some know him, and the Talmudim, or disciples as people know them, during that time period, what Christians call the Old Testament today was not called the Tanakh in that time period. It was called the Torah. The whole book was called the Torah, not just the first 5 books. That's something that's come about since then. They call the first 5 books the Torah, and then they call the writings of the Psalm and the Proverbs, they call those the writings, the Ketuvim, and then you have the stuff that was written by the prophets, and they call that the Nevi'im. The prophets is what that translates to in English. So you have T for Torah, right? N for the Nevi'im, or the prophets, and then the Kesach at the end, the Ketuvim, Tanakh. So now they call what the Christians think of as the Old Testament is now called the Tanakh. And then they call the first 5 books that contains the law and the instruction, they call it the Torah, because they're calling it, overall, they're just calling it the instruction rather than calling it the law. But in the biblical period, the whole thing that we think of as Tanakh today was called Torah. Okay, so the word Torah is from the root yara, which is to cast, it's to lay a foundation. So if you pour a cement slab, that's your foundation. And then on top of that foundation, you build your house, barn, or whatever it is that you're building, right? Because that's the foundation that you build upon. So the instruction, the knowing the instructions, and knowing the law and knowing how to apply them is called the foundation. So when we're born, life does, in fact, come with an instruction manual. It's called the Torah. It's what the Christians think of as the Old Testament, the whole thing. It's the instruction to life. It tells you how to raise your children. It tells you how to live your life. It tells you what's right and wrong in every situation. It's all there. The foundation is there. And that without that knowledge, you cannot read what they call the New Testament and expect to understand it. Because you cannot build a house. If you build a house right just directly on the sand, what's going to happen? You're not going to need much of a storm for it to fall apart, are you? You're not going to need much of a flood for it to fall apart, because the ground's going to come move and all of that underneath it, right? Yeah, not the smartest thing to do. And in Texas, the termites are going to eat it in no time flat. You go build it on the ground. No, you got to build a house on the foundation. And so if you're talking about what they call the New Testament, those are letters that have everything to do with the foundation. Without the foundation, how can you understand what the letters are talking about? You can't. Anyway, it's followed by the word va'ain, and that's nothingness, emptiness, vacuity, if you will. And then that's followed by lamo. So there's emptiness. Lamo is to him. Literally, it's to he, but to him is what they mean by that. Then it follows that with Michshol, offend. They say that against which anyone stumbles, a stumbling block. Figuratively, a cause of the failing, a cause of the falling of anyone, incitement to go astray. What are they saying here? They're saying that when they talk about somebody stumbling, when they talk about somebody falling, they're talking about somebody who stops living according to the Torah. If you cause any of these small ones to stumble, if you cause any of these babes in God to fall away from Torah observance, that's what he's talking about. Yehezkel, or Ezekiel, as most people know it, chapter 7, verse 19 says, their incitement to sin. In other words, the images of their gods, their idols, caused them not to live according to the Torah, because when they saw their idols, they would bow down and worship them. So it was their idols were their stumbling block. It was the thing that caused offense, caused them to have hesitation of conscience. It's from the root kashal, which is to waver, to totter, to stagger. Properly signifies to totter in the ankles, to waddle, to reel, to sink together, used of one about to fall, to stumble. And when they're talking about stumbling and falling and offense in the Bible, they're talking about walking away from the Torah. All right, so here's the translation. Again, we're on Tehillim, or Psalm 119, 165. Great peace to the one who desires, breathes after, longs for, is inclined to, and intimate with your Torah. And nothing to him is a stumbling block. I want to read that again. Great peace. That's that word, Rob, that great. The peace is so far beyond the average person's peace. Remember, the example I gave was on education. Everybody, just in general, they had the whole first 5 books of the Bible committed to memory by the time they were 12 to 18 years old, right? That's the average Joe. So when you talk about a rabbi, his information and his understanding and his knowledge of the Bible, of those first 5 books, is so far beyond that they use this word Rob. And so now we talk about peace. This is peace that is so far beyond peace that any regular human could ever experience or understand. It's way beyond that. Great peace to the one who desires, breathes after, longs for, is inclined to, and intimate with your Torah, with God's Torah. And nothing to him is a stumbling block. When you know that Torah this well, when you really know your Torah, nothing can cause you to stumble. Nothing can cause you to walk away from Torah observance. Nothing. When you reach that point, you have a peace that passes all understanding. Psalm 119, 165. So did you catch it? It said your Torah, not the Jews' Torah, God's Torah. That's a mistake that everybody makes in the Western world. They try to make the Old Testament, the Jews, and the New Testament, the Gentiles. No, the Torah belongs to God. It's holy. It's perfect. It's pure. You know it's called that in the New Testament letters as well? Holy, perfect, and pure. Yeah, it's in there. The Torah is the foundation that keeps us from stumbling. The Torah is. Wonder why all these Christians fall away within 6 months to a year? They have no foundation. There is no foundation without the Torah. There's no stability, no certainty. The Torah is not a Yehudit document. It is not a Jewish document. It is the perfect word of God, preserved in the Ivrit language, that's the Hebrew language, given to the Yehudi, or the Jewish people, by God Almighty. It is God's word, not the Yehudim word. It is not the Jews' word. It is God's word. Why do I keep saying this? Well, because when we reject all things Yehudi, when we reject all things Jewish, we reject all things biblical. We reject all things godly. Because God chose the Yehudim. He chose the Jews. It was his choice, and he chose them first. And then he did not replace them. Anyone who wanted to be a part of his covenant had to be grafted into that covenant. So you're not converting from being a sinner to being a Christian. You're converting from being a sinner, from whatever it is that you're being converted from, into Judaism. Because it's the only people God ever chose, the only covenant God ever gave. The Yehudim, the Jews, were not replaced or rejected by God. If they had, the Goim, the Gentiles, would have no hope. None whatsoever. The hope of the Goim, the hope of the Gentiles, is that they become grafted into the Yehudi, or Jewish covenant. The Torah is the only foundation, and when we reject it, we live our lives on shaky ground, never knowing when we will stumble or even why we stumble. Now let's look at something from the Separim Shelihim, the New Testament. Let's begin with Yochanan, that's John, chapter 15, verse 13. It starts off, the Greek is mezona, which is greater. They use it in place of the Hebrew word gadol. It's great, of magnitude and extent, large, of number and multitude. They give an example, Bereshit, which is Genesis 29:7. As yet the day is great. The day is great. That's an idiom. It means there's a lot of day left. It's morning time. It just got started. The day is great. Especially of elders and the eldest. Our friend Glenn can really relate to this. He's the greatest among us. Anyway, they also use it of people who are great in power, nobility, and people who are wealthy and that kind of thing. It's more of a Greek thing. It really is Greek when it gets down to that, not so much Hebrew. That's followed by tautes, which is this. They would say hazeh in Hebrew. Then that's agape, which you hear agape there. Everybody's familiar with that. It's used in place of the Hebrew word ahav, to desire, to breathe after, to long for, to be inclined to. You remember that word? Then they have odes, which is nothingness, the word ain, the nothingness, the emptiness, the vacuity. And then I didn't put the Greek down. It's going to be anthropos, the word for man. I think I'm using the right word there. That I'm talking about amp killer, I'm not sure. Anyway, that's used in place of the Hebrew word ish, or in this case it would be le-ish, to man. But it's a man as opposed to a woman. It's a male. They say ehe, which is for the word has, and they say ina, which is hazeh, this. And then tis is going to be in place of the word for man again. Tain, which is really has no meaning here for us. It's usually for the definite article. And then it says, and I never say this right because the PS word in Greek really throws me. That's that one that looks like Poseidon's pitchfork thingy. It makes the ps sound, so it's psuhein. Anyway, it's for life. It's nafesh in Hebrew. It's the breath, to breathe, the soul. It's the part of you that lives on, right? And then altau, it's his. Thay, which is lay down. So it's used. This word is used in place of the Hebrew soon. It's to put, to place, to set, especially to constitute anyone. uh, to give them a law. It's used a foundation, if you're not catching it. To endeavor towards something properly, to direct the heart or mind to regard. It sets your mind in a certain direction. To apply the heart to anything, to devote oneself to anything, to turn the heart to anything, to put it in your sights. This is what I'm going to make important. Huper, which means for. Tone is again a definite article. Does it mean much here? This is philon, and maybe you hear philos in that. Everyone's heard of that. Friend. In Hebrew, this is there. You're going to use the word reah, which is a companion, a friend with whom one has conversation. Friend or companion is also said of a lover. Now, this is where you get into the real Jewish understanding of this. A lover, one beloved of a woman. What they're talking about is that in biblical Hebrew, the way they spoke was very vastly different than us. If you were going to take a wife, when you first proposed, she would put a veil over her face, and that was restriction of access, right? And so when you became friend with your wife, when you became what they call lover with your wife, that meant that the veil was taken away. So you've gone through the marriage, and now you're married. The veil is taken away. There is no restriction of access. You have a face-to-face relationship. And that's what they mean by this. It's why they talk about men being lovers in the Bible, and it throws some people off, because that just means that this guy knows everything there is to know about that guy, and vice versa. And he knows him better than he knows himself, kind of a thing. You can't fool him because he knows you too well, because you have that kind of a relationship. You have that face-to-face, intimate relationship. And so that's what they're talking about. It's from the root ra'ah, which is to feed a flock, to pasture, to tend, and figuratively to guard, to care for, to rule, properly to have the sense of looking upon, to look upon with pleasure, to look after, to behold, figuratively to pasture, is used of to govern, to rule, of a prince. It's of a teacher of virtue and wisdom, to nourish, to feed, to delight in any person or thing. Something that Gesenius said in his book was that the things that pleased us, that were before us, that we found pleasing, our eyes would linger on that. We don't live in a society like that anymore. People, for whatever reason, today's children seem to like to linger their eyes on blood, guts, and gore. So we can't really put that in our explanation anymore. So anyway, here's the Amplified translation of Yochanan. It's John 15:13. Greater desire, longing, and intimacy has no man than this, that a man set his heart and mind regarding, devoting himself, preferring, and giving his very soul for his intimate friend or friends. Here's a regular translation. No one has greater love than this, that someone lay down his life for his close friend. And so when you read it, you think he's talking, Yeshua's saying this is because he's going to die on the cross. He's saying, no one has greater love for you guys than me, because I'm going to die for you. And it becomes all of this, oh, we're all so enlightened. We're going to go die for some perfectly stranger that we don't know. And that proves that we have great love for our neighbors. No, this isn't about dying. This isn't about taking a bullet for somebody else. People will do that not out of love, but out of duty. Think about it. If you're a military person, you get this. You know that there are, your superior officers need to stay alive because they command the whole company, right? And so if you have to take a bullet for that superior officer to keep him alive so that you can win the war, that's what you do. If you're in the Secret Service and you're there to protect the president, you do that because he's important to your nation. And so you give up your life not because you love your president. You do it because you love your country, true, but you do it because it's your job. It's your sense of duty. It's not about you loving some person, right? So this isn't about us taking a bullet for somebody, and that proves that we have great love. Maybe we're just suicidal and saw our way out. There's all kinds of reasons for it, right? No, women should be able to get this better than anybody, because not these days, but my generation and before, women laid down their whole lives for their husbands and their children's. That's kind of a double negative there, or double plural. They laid down their whole lives. They gave up their whole lives. They could have gone on to school and became career oriented and all that kind of stuff. But instead, they lay down their whole lives and they stay home and they raise those children and they help those children with their homework and they help set those a good foundation under their children and point them toward a good college and they clean the house and do the dishes and cook the food and they lay down their lives because they love somebody. A lot of guys don't get that because they don't give up their lives. They selfishly go through life chasing every dream they have and doing everything that they can to advance themselves. But women can surely get what they're talking about, laying down their life for someone, showing that they have great love for them. Because that's exactly what John 15:13 is talking about. All right, so if we look at the next verse, no, it's not the next verse because this is chapter 3. If we look at John 3:16. No, it's First John. I thought, well, that can't be right. In Greek, it's First John 3:16. In Greek, the first word is en. In Greek, it's en. It's our word ayin. In. It would just be a sound in Hebrew. It'd just be be. Tauto. Then it says egnokamen. Egnokamen. It's perceive. We perceive. So it's the Hebrew word yada. It's to see and hence to perceive, to acquire knowledge, to know, to be acquainted. The signification both of seeing and knowing, to know, to perceive, to be aware of, whether by the eyes or by the touch, often by the mind, and hence to understand. To get to know, to discover, whether by seeing or hearing. To know by experience, to experience. To know, to become acquainted with anyone. Use of a man knowing a woman. This is like when you're dating, you've met this girl and you think she might be the one, and you go to drop her off at her place, and you both just sit there and talk, and then the next thing you know, the sun's coming up, and you both got to run off and get cleaned up and go to work, right? That's getting to know the woman. That's what they're talking about. Becoming acquainted. It's studying their face and knowing every little flaw and every little extra piece of fuzz. You know what I'm saying? Every little wrinkle. It's that kind of getting to know. Tain agape. You hear agape, the love, the ahav, the leaning toward, the breathing after, the desiring, the being inclined toward. Ote, which is because. Ekanos, he, uper is for. Amon is us. Tain, Sukain, there's your word, the life, the soul, the breathe, the thing that makes you live, the part of you that lives on. Alto, his, so it's his soul. Athekan, so Athekan, that's that soon, laid down his soul. No greater love is someone than someone who will lay down their soul. This isn't about him denying the cross. It's about him giving up. He had to set a foundation in us to save us. It'll make sense in a minute. Kai ame, so it's and we, Ophelo men, we ought, uper, for tone, the, adelphone, we ought to, for the brothers. A brother. It is applied also to those who are not our own brothers, as those who are children of one father by different mothers, of vice versa. I'm guessing that's vice versa. Brothers by the same mother and different fathers. It can be, so it's step brothers, half brothers, sometimes emphatically used of brethren, both by the father and the mother, any relative, kinsman, a man of the same tribe, someone of the same religion. You can call someone your brother because you were both military, so he's your brother in arms. You can call someone your brother because he's your best friend, right? So before it was an intimate friend, now it's anyone who is of the faithfulness, because that's what they're talking about very specifically. When they talk about a brother, they're talking about somebody who lives out the same religious lifestyle that you live out. In other words, a brother biblically is someone who's Torah observant. If they called you a brother, that's almost emphatically, almost exclusively what they're talking about. They did at times call siblings brothers, but it would be better rendered sibling than brother. Mostly, if they called you a brother, they were talking about people who were Torah observant. Then it says tos, which is our, and then there's that suchas word, the life, the soul, and all that kind of stuff. And sum, the laying down word again. So here's the Amplified translation. It's First Yohanan, or First John 3:16. And this is, again, the Amplified. Hereby we see, perceive, acquire knowledge, become acquainted with. We are aware of by the eyes and with the touch. Our minds understand. We get to know by discovery and experience. We desire, we have longing and intimate love because he, speaking of God, set his heart and mind regarding devoting himself, preferring and giving his very soul for us. And we ought to set our heart and mind regarding devoting ourselves, preferring and giving our very soul for our brothers in the faithfulness. So here's the regular translation, easier to understand. First Yohanan, 1 John 3:16. In this we know love, for he laid down his life for us, and we therefore should lay down our lives for the Torah observant ones, for the brothers. Laying down our lives for a brother has nothing to do with dying. I hope you're starting to get this. Yeshua was not referring to the cross. He was referring to everything else he gave up for his intimate friends. Yochanan, John, was not talking about dying a physical death. He was talking about all that we give up for the sake of others. Those of us who give up our lives do it for our intimate friends. There is not enough time in the day to help everyone else, and we're not being asked to. Rejections of all things Yehudit, all things Jewish, is rejection of God's perfect will. God's perfect will was to make a covenant with the Yehudim, with the Jews, and to graft Gentiles into that same covenant. It was his plan from the very beginning. Without a covenant with God, man is lost, and there is only one covenant. It is a Yehudi, or Jewish covenant. The only way anyone can live their lives on a stable foundation is for them to love God's Torah, remember? Torah means foundation. It is the instruction that gives us a foundation in our lives. Consider something else John said in the same passage, 1 John 3:4. Everyone who commits sin also violates the Torah, for sin is Torah rebellion. Did you catch it? This is New Testament, by the way. 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. Everyone who commits sin also violates the Torah, for sin is Torah rebellion. Sin, sin, sin is Torah rebellion. How can we expect to live our lives without sin if we don't take the time to learn what the law is? We won't know if we're rebelling against it if we don't know what it is. How can we expect to lay our lives down for the brethren if we have no foundation? If we all just give up our lives and die, there will be no one left to preach the gospel. First, a foundation must be established in us. We are not supposed to go save the world and lay down our lives the day we get saved. It will destroy us and probably destroy those whom we are trying to help. The foundation that is to be established in us is the Torah of God. It will be written in our hearts and minds when we learn what it says. God's law is a perfect law that can be summed up in one statement: love your neighbor as yourself. The law, the Torah, God's Torah, is a book of instructions on how we can carry out our love for our neighbors. The law will set us free from the bondage of this world. The law will set us free from the legalism of ignorance. The law will set us free from sin. Shalom, Beshalom.